Once you have completed the Use of Restrictive Procedures physical holding form and have notified a member of the Building Oversight Committee of the use of restrictive procedures on a student, you will need to schedule and hold a staff debriefing meeting. This meeting needs to take place within 2 school days following the incident, but should happen as soon as possible. Individuals who should be in attendance at this meeting include those who implemented or oversaw the physical holding, the student's case manager, and at least one staff member who has knowledge of behaviors who is not involved in the incident. Some buildings may require this person to be an administrator or school psychologist. During this staff debriefing meeting, the team will fill out the corresponding form in SPED forms. You can find this form under the Restrictive Procedures section. This video will walk you through the completion of this specific form. First, you'll need to enter the date of the incident and the date of the debriefing meeting. The rest of the information at the top of this form should be filled out for you. Next, you will indicate whether or not the student was on an IEP and if a BIP or BSP was in place. Then, you will indicate whether or not the supports outlined in the IEP and behavior support plan were implemented correctly. As with the use of physical holding form, the debriefing process will need to be completed even if the student is not in special ed. The information recorded here will reflect this. The next section on this form asks the team to identify the antecedents, triggers, and proactive interventions used prior to escalation. We need to describe the environmental events that took place immediately before the behavior escalated and what actions staff took to support the student proactively. The next question asks you to describe the impact of these less restrictive interventions. This section should be an objective description of the student's behavior in response to the specific proactive interventions that were used. Did the student ignore or not respond? Did behavior increase further? Did the student respond positively to some of the proactive supports? Did certain environmental variables cause these supports to be ineffective? This next question asks what behavior necessitated the use of a restrictive procedure. This should be the same behavior identified on the use of physical holding form when you are asked to describe the emergency. If you've seen part 1 of this video tutorial, this information will be redundant, but it's so important we remember that we can only be using physical holding in emergencies. An emergency is not property destruction no matter how significant unless doing so may cause harm to the child. It's not hiding under a desk or a table, running from staff, refusing to go to class, or noncompliance. Again, unless failing to respond would result in physical injury. When filling out this section, it may be a good time for the team to talk about why this specific behavior was deemed an emergency and make sure everyone is on the same page. After describing the behavior that necessitated a hold, the team will need to describe student and staff behavior during the incident. This should be an objective description of exactly what happened. Having the entire team around the table when describing this is helpful to remember specific details and to hear how the incident unfolded from each person's perspective. Typically, physical holding happens in crisis situations, and recall can be tough when people had been acting on adrenaline. After you've described the staff and student behavior during the incident, the team will have a discussion about which of the described staff actions helped and which did not help. The purpose of holding these debriefing meetings is to learn from situations and be able to use problem solving to adapt and modify our responses and supports accordingly. This question especially digs into that. The next question on this form asks for you to describe the procedure used to return the student to his or her routine activity. This may be a calming strategy that worked to de-escalate the student, or maybe a description of how the student self-calmed. Often, there's a process of debriefing with the student after a situation that helps them to de-escalate and prepare to return to class. Whatever procedure you use with this particular student would be recorded here. This next section is a series of yes and no questions, most of which should have already been reported in the use of restrictive procedures physical holding form. Here, the team will answer whether or not the hold was in response to an emergency situation, whether or not the hold was the least restrictive intervention, and if the hold ended when the threat of harm ended. The next question, if corrective action may be needed, would be a yes if untrained individuals implemented a hold, if a non-CPI hold was used, if a hold was used but the behavior was not an emergency, or other instances in which the response was not appropriate or compliant. Then, you will indicate if the behavior is likely to recur. Following this series of questions, you'll need to indicate what follow-up action is being taken to prevent the need for future use of restrictive procedures. This may include training more staff on de-escalation techniques, modifying the student support plan, or creating a support plan if one is not in place. It may include modification of the environment to prevent the trigger from occurring. Whatever staff are doing to preventatively avoid using holds on the student should be recorded here. This last section of this form is a series of yes and no questions about the student's behavior history. Per Minnesota statute, if a student has been restrained on 2 separate days during a 30-day period, or a pattern of use emerges, or a parent requests at any time, an IEP team meeting must be held within 10 calendar days to review the use of restrictive procedures. This meeting should take place under these circumstances, even if the behavior support plan outlines the use of restrictive procedures and is also applicable for general education students. In the case of Gen Ed, you would need to assemble a team equivalent to that of an IEP team. The purpose of this mandatory IEP meeting is to ensure that the school team is actively reviewing, problem-solving, and modifying supports to prevent the use of physical holding in the future, and that we're being transparent about these situations with parents. Once the team has determined if an IEP meeting is necessary, you need to record who attended the staff debriefing meeting and denote the facilitator. Again, all staff involved in either implementing or overseeing the hold, the case manager, and one uninvolved party should be in attendance at this meeting. Then all that's left to do is save and finalize. If you have any questions regarding the use of restrictive procedures in your building, completing the follow-up documentation, or holding an IEP meeting in response to the use of restrictive procedures, contact your Social Behavior Collaborative Planner.